Hi, everyone. Welcome to our new episode. Today we have with us Dr. Lidster. She's a Career Development Fellow at Corpus Christi College and lecturer at Wadham College, University of Oxford. So her research focuses on Shakespeare and early modern literature with an emphasis on performance practices, book history, wartime culture, and the global reception and afterlives of texts. So from what I can tell from your research, you're very interested in a range of topics across Shakespearean and early modern texts, including book history and wartime culture. And I know a lot of graduate students find it a bit difficult sometimes to pinpoint their research on something or someone. And I was wondering what you think of that process of choosing what or who to study. How do you approach that process of pinning down what or who resonates with you? And what led you to your own research?
That's a great question, and one that's difficult to answer, one that I also return to many times as I begin new projects. I think even going back to my undergraduate days, I've always had an interest in ideas of history, history and memory. I have a disciplinary background in literature, so I'm coming at these questions from the perspective of someone who mainly specializes in literature. And I think that interest, and it's an interest that is not just something in my professional life, but it's also something that is a part of my personal life as well. Questions about how we access the past and think about history, how our own personal histories and our families' histories, and the kind of responsibility I think that underlies the construction of narratives and how that affects how you might act in the present. So like these humanist questions about using the past as a model for action in the present. That's been something that's always been quite a key interest for me. But then going from something like that to developing specific projects is a different case. And I think I've always been listening and looking out for, I think reading widely and doing some research, knowing your stuff, and if there's something that hasn't been covered before, if you come across material that maybe hasn't been explored from an angle that interests you, I think those are good strategies to find a way in that might be different. I think if you said to me when I was a master's student that I would spend 5 years or so working on wartime Shakespeare, I probably would have been a bit surprised, but I wouldn't have been shocked by that. But it could, because there is a clear connection to this interest I have in accounts of the past and who gets to negotiate history, and how can history be used for propagandistic reasons, that those kinds of things. So there's a link there, but that was a kind of a case of just being open to an avenue that might not have been obvious to me. It was sort of having conversations with other colleagues. And at this point, I was in King's College in London, and there was an opportunity to collaborate with colleagues from the War Studies department. So it was just taking advantage of that opportunity. And then, this project arose from that. So, yeah, I think in advice that I would say would be, choosing something that interests you, because obviously if you spend your time working on something that you don't enjoy, that's not really going to work very well. But knowing your material, being open to opportunities and to new conversations. And I think also maybe something about knowing where your strengths lie as a researcher or as a student, not necessarily in terms of what you know or what you've already done, but if there's an approach that that you take that might be different or distinctive from other people. I mean, for me, for example, I like working with a lot of material and processing a lot of material, and learning a lot about historical context, about society, about literature in a period, reading through hundreds of newspaper articles, periodicals from that time. So like kind of engaging with a huge amount of primary material and then trying to pull that together to create a narrative or argument. And that's not everybody's kind of preference when it comes to research. Some people are amazing, close readers, can do so much with a couple of lines of text. But I think it's sort of like knowing your strengths. And I think I enjoy the challenge of grappling with a lot of materials. So that's why I've sort of gravitated to projects that involve transhistorical studies of history and literature.
Definitely. That kind of interdisciplinary approach almost to literature. Yeah, definitely. I would love to speak a little bit about your book, Wartime Shakespeare, Performing Narratives of Conflict, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. So as the book's abstract describes, quote, "This is the first book-length interdisciplinary study of how Shakespeare has been mobilized in performance at times of conflict spanning the 18th to the 21st century." So before we get into the material, can you please tell us a little bit about some of the key themes at play in the time periods we're looking at today? What was happening socially, politically, and economically in these times of conflict for those who don't know? And how did this impact its literature and its theater?
Yeah, well, that is a big question.
Definitely.
It's one that's I mean, it's difficult to summarize because for each conflict that I consider in the book, the political, social, theatrical conditions are so different, and they're not even in some ways, in some cases, agreed upon. I mean, just to give a sense of the range of conflicts that I look at, I briefly begin with the 9 Years' War in the late 1630s, 17th century. In the 18th century, I'm looking at the 7 Years' War, the American War of Independence, the French Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars. Into the 19th century, the Crimean War briefly, the First and Second World Wars in the 20th century. And then the Iraq War in the 21st century, and I briefly end with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it's and these conflicts cover imperialist, expansionist wars, defensive wars, revolutions, and even interventionist wars. So there's a lot of very different political contexts at play. And so that was part of the challenge and joy of learning a lot about these different conflicts. And also what I should say about the book is my emphasis is on wars with British involvement. So there are many more conflicts that could have been considered in this book, but to give some coherence to the narrative, that was what I was examining as I was going through the book, whilst also taking account of non-British users as well. So I suppose if I were to summarize some of the kind of themes that are explored within the book, and maybe some overarching patterns. What I found so interesting about using Shakespeare as a focus for this kind of study is the fact that Shakespeare has been used so frequently during periods of war. I mean, one could spend a lifetime in some ways researching this topic and looking at other conflicts and other contexts within specific conflicts. And what I found really interesting was that often some of the central uses with each conflict could link to an issue that might be at the heart of that conflict. So some of the topics I consider are the use of Shakespeare in shaping the narrative of the 7 Years' War, or the use of Shakespeare as propaganda during the American War of Independence, the use of Shakespeare and ideas of patriotism during the French Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, the fragmentation of Shakespeare's appeal in the 2 world wars, And then in the Iraq War, looking at Shakespeare and the just war tradition, just war theory. So my aim here is to sort of use Shakespeare to sort of dig deeper into some of the political issues that might be at the heart of a specific conflict. And in terms of how Shakespeare is used across that time, I mean, I think there's from a British perspective, I think there's a movement outwards. So if we go back to the 17th century, for example, a lot of the uses of Shakespeare in the 17th century tend to be linked to civil conflict. So Shakespeare is used in the English Civil War. Milton, for example, John Milton describes Shakespeare, and specifically Shakespeare's Richard III, as the closet companion of Charles I. So Shakespeare becomes a kind of royalist figurehead in that specific example, and he's used a bit later in the Exclusion Crisis. In the 18th century, Shakespeare becomes that a sort of a British figurehead on a global stage for imperialist wars. But then he's also fought over during the American War of Independence as well in really interesting ways. And then I think as we move more towards the 20th century, there are more conflicted. Shakespeare was used very frequently, and not just within Britain, but globally by Germany, by many other states as well. And we can sense that there's a lot of fighting and grumbling over Shakespeare. And then I think what's really interesting today, looking at 21st century conflicts, is the diversity of users and using Shakespeare in a way that is not just about or drawing on any legacy of Shakespeare being a British or English dramatist, which I think is really fascinating. And one example could be thinking of recent uses of Shakespeare in Ukraine. So yeah, so there's a real the kind of diversity of context, the diversity of uses was something that really appealed to me in this project.
Definitely. And I will say one of your conclusions in this book, to quote the abstract, is that, quote, wartime Shakespeare is defined by its malleability and in plural misunderstandings, which determine its power to shape the experience of war, the political issues at stake during a period of crisis, and the construction of narratives of conflict. So I think that's exactly what you're talking about right there. And it's beautifully said. And this idea of text shaping the war and shaping perceptions of war and shaping perceptions of wartime, I think is also a key thing here, which I think is fascinating as well. So I also wanted to ask you, how did performances and interpretations of these plays vary throughout different war times and times of conflict throughout the 18th to 20th centuries? How were people approaching these plays differently? How were the same plays being read and performed differently based on what conflict a nation might be in, if at all?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, one of the things that surprised me with this work, I think going into this topic, I perhaps expected that what I might find is a movement from using Shakespeare as a kind of patriotic figurehead, so potentially pro-war often, and maybe performances of plays would also support that kind of reading, and then potentially there might be a shift. I was expecting maybe there could be a shift, maybe mid 20th century, perhaps post World War II, when Shakespeare tends to be used perhaps to critique war, question its justification. So that was in some ways a narrative that I went into this project thinking I might find. And I mean, sort of going back to this, the one of the earlier points I made about why I like researching history, and that is to do with the sort of the responsibility that's linked to that, and the fact that writing about the past, recording interpretations of Shakespeare's plays across centuries, it's always about an act of there's always an act of forgetting that's involved in that. And it's being attentive to what is being forgotten. And what stood out to me about what's being forgotten in this trans-historical study is the kind of the conflicting interpretations of Shakespeare that begins right at the start, and goes right through. So we don't, it's not exclusively a patriotic pro-war Shakespeare that we find in the 18th century, and then, you know, and now we have a Shakespeare who voices critique when it comes to wartime. So one of the things that my book sort of draws attention to is the fact that that you have, especially because my emphasis is on theatre, that one production can actually be used and read in different ways by the range of individuals who are involved in it. So while we can, I mean, I could say, if we take a play like Henry V as an example, I mean, there does tend to be an emphasis on using Henry V in the 18th century. For example, Britain is at war with France for the majority of the 18th century. So you have Henry V appearing quite often during conflict, often with a subtitle on playbills saying Henry V or on the conquest of France. And there are responses and reviews that kind of lean into that kind of reading. And I haven't been able to find evidence of productions of Henry V that maybe critique conflict so much until we get to the 20th century, although you have people like William Hazlitt saying in the 19th century that Henry V is a very amiable monster, drawing attention to how flawed his reasons are for engaging in war with France. So I think maybe Henry V we could see a shift from sort of more patriotic rallying productions to then something that is more attentive to the troubling aspects of Henry's representation. But then for other plays, what was really striking for me is just how individuals use and interpret a play or a production within the one context, but in different ways. I mean, I could give an example of in the Second World War, for example, two actors and real life husband and wife, Lewis Casson and Sybil Thorndike, took a production of Macbeth on tour initially in Wales, and the idea of this was to bring Shakespeare to places within Britain that might not have seen live theatre before, something to keep people's spirits up during the conflict. And this was a production of Macbeth that essentially styled Macbeth as Hitler, and had a prologue that essentially said, Macbeth is a perfect picture of a dictator, of a tyrant. It's relevant for us today. People who are power hungry don't change in 1,000 years. So this seems to be sort of a play that is supporting the defensive, the Allied war effort. And even one aspect of the production took children to play Macduff's children who are murdered in the play. Rather than touring with children, they took children from each village that they were performing in to play those parts. So that community would see, members of their own community, being murdered by what in the play becomes Macbeth's Gestapo. But then at the same time, Thorndike and also Casson as well were pacifists. So Thorndike sponsored the Peace Pledge Union, and actually was wanting to engage with Shakespeare to point out to give a sort of anti-fascist reading, to show a picture of a dictator. But at the same time, it was not something that was supposed to, for her, encourage a military resistance against and take arms against this dictator. So those kinds of uses where you might have an anti-fascist, but also in some ways an anti-war, anti-militaristic Shakespeare is one of the kind of pivotal things that I've found throughout Shakespeare's wartime history, that the different individuals who are involved in a performance, the adapters, the actors, the sponsors, government agents, reviewers, audience members, even wider afield, they all have different agendas, and they can read and use each play in different ways. And Macbeth is one of those plays that just seems to be can really be used to put forward very different readings. It was used the French Revolutionary Wars for anti-revolutionary and revolutionary readings, sometimes even within the same production. So I think that was one of the things that really stood out to me for how Shakespeare can change, but there's also stuff that stays the same.
Definitely. Wow. Thank you so much for that, like very in-depth, like kind of examples. No, definitely. I think it's really interesting for a text to be so malleable, as you say, and for a text to be interpreted in so many different ways, given times of conflict are similar in so many ways, right? But due to the nature of the nation that the conflict is taking place in, different nationalities, different cultures, obviously people are approaching this conflict differently. And of course, every conflict is different, even though conflicts share certain similarities. But I think that makes sense that it's being reflected in the performances, that certain things are similar as they are all times of conflict, but certain things change drastically. And I think what you were saying about that pacifist reading is also really interesting, where it could be anti-fascist, but also anti-war. Whereas one reading might be anti-fascist and pro-war. That's also a very interesting distinction as well. So in your introduction to Wartime Shakespeare, which is entitled A History of Wartime Production and Reception, you look at the British Expeditionary Force's performance of Hamlet. And you write how this performance, quote, united the soldiers in the service of another national cause, the great thoughts of our great writers, and provided them with food for the mind. So this production is seen to activate an underlying wartime confidence that is explicitly linked to the audience's shared ownership of Shakespeare as text, performance, and cultural figure, you write. And as you explain, theater and literature have a kind of potential to unite citizens of a nation under a sense of shared nationalism, shared identity, shared ownership. So do you think that this shared ownership is due to the fact that Shakespeare was English and is thus part of this shared English past for the British Expeditionary Force? Or does theater in general have a more widespread potential to unite people? In other words, is it also that theater has that capacity as well in and of itself to bring people together into a kind of shared experience or shared consciousness as a part of one audience or one mind, one experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, just to go back to that specific production, so it was a really interesting account that was reported in the Times newspaper of this performance of Hamlet that took place within a few hours of the front in during the First World War. And the account that's printed in the Times, which is the evidence that we have for this performance, does draw attention to some of the things that you're mentioning about what theatre can do in terms of creating a sense of community and a sense of shared experience. So that this account describes how the soldiers are sourcing copies of the plays, they're finding costumes from a local business, and they're making the scenery together, and then they're putting on the play together. And it was a play involving a few scenes from Hamlet, and then interestingly, Henry V comes out at the end and gives his rallying speech to encourage the soldiers to go off and fight. So kind of it's a sort of spliced together play. So I think we get a sense of what theatre can do within that account. But also what I think is to kind of also address the question about identities and ownership of Shakespeare. the individual writing the account describes how, you know, Shakespeare is performing Shakespeare is serving the great thoughts of our great writers and is providing food for the mind. And in some ways, the account creates a bit of an impossible fiction or an impossible unity, which the writer of the account almost seems to be omnipotent and omnipresent, and is behind the scenes and is in the audience at the same time, and is saying how, you know, everyone is united in putting on this play and being inspired by this play. And once the soldiers leave the play, they are thinking alike. You know, there is no diversity in that narrative. And this again is something that recurs often throughout Shakespeare's wartime use. And whenever you get an emphatic account of unity, I think it's always a point to pause and to question, you know, who is writing this account, and do they have a particular agenda in mind, and what's the evidence for this this kind of use. And that's one of the ways in which Shakespeare across centuries has been very impactful, by suggesting that the performers can get behind the rallying power of Shakespeare as a cultural figurehead, and for as you say, for England, for Britain. We've got a slippage between English and British identity with Shakespeare. And in a way that is disputed. I mean, I think there's a really interesting example, just to unpack the distinction between Shakespeare as a representative of Englishness versus Britishness. In the First World War, there was a piece in the London Scottish Regimental Gazette that pointed out you could walk far and wide in England and not meet a working man who had read a page of Shakespeare, but you can't walk far and wide in Scotland without finding a working man who had read many pages of Robert Burns. So it's in that sense saying, you know, Shakespeare is not for Scottish working class individuals, Shakespeare is not our writer. You know, we have Robert Burns, and Shakespeare isn't even the writer for England either, because lots of working class readers aren't interested. So there's always this conflicting reading, even within ideas of Englishness and Britishness. But again, I mean, I guess if we sort of step back even further, I mean, Shakespeare has been used so frequently by non-British users, and in ways that are really significant. I mean, in the First World War, Shakespeare was fought over by Germany. So Germany elevated Shakespeare as their kind of third national dramatist alongside Goethe and Schiller. It was unser Shakespeare, it was our Shakespeare. Shakespeare is not British, Shakespeare is German. And similarly, you know, we can see in one of the chapters I look at Daoud's production of Romeo and Juliet in Baghdad, which was performed just after the official end of the Iraq War, and this was in 2012. And in this production, performed in Baghdad, we've got accounts of audience members coming up and saying, you know, this is a play about us. This is a play about our reality. So there is that way in which Shakespeare can become a figurehead, and also can provide the material for many nations and states to reflect on their own realities and their own experiences. So I feel as if Shakespeare is moved beyond the boundaries of Englishness and Britishness, and theatre is definitely something that encourages that sense of a shared experience. I think it becomes especially so when a wartime context is very prominent. So in that example of Romeo and Juliet in Baghdad, I mean, this is performed and staged by individuals who have firsthand experience of conflict and still experiencing the concerns over the safety of their families and loved ones. So if you compare that to performances of those plays within the West, when you're removed from the front line of conflict, there can perhaps sometimes not, or you don't get the sense of that same unity and collectiveness or shared experience, especially when it comes to productions at times of conflict.
That's really, really fascinating. So Shakespeare is not only being used as an emblem of Englishness or Britishness, but it's actually being used as, he is actually being used as an emblem of togetherness and unity for any country, like Germany, as you're saying. I did not know that. That's really, really interesting. And yeah, I guess the idea that theater can bring everyone together under one roof is also reflected in that idea that Shakespeare can bring together a nation as you claim him as your national spokesperson, even though he may not actually have your nationality. That is also like a kind of really interesting doubling, that he's kind of acting as not only a cultural figure, but as the theater himself, that also, he holds the theater together, and you go into the theater and you're under Shakespeare and you're under the influence of the theater. That's really, really interesting. And I would love to turn to also Northrop Frye's conception of the green world of Shakespearean comedy, often a place where characters and audience members alike can suspend societal constraints and escape into kind of an imaginary. So this is the space of the forest in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and As You Like It. It's a space where social and personal conflicts can be worked through. And often characters go into this space and come out having resolved whatever they have to resolve. And it mirrors reality as well, as we're talking about theater. So with theater itself acting as a green world for individuals to escape into and suspend their own realities for a time. And I wanted to ask you, how does the concept of the green world relate to your work on Wartime Shakespeare, if at all? Do you see these performances functioning as a space to momentarily also escape the conflicts outside and attempt to grapple with, understand, work through them, as Shakespeare's characters also attempt to do in their own green worlds? I'm thinking of the lovers in A Midsummer Night's Dream. They escape into the forest to actually leave behind the Athens government, and to leave behind oppressive regimes, the regimes that keep one lover away from another. And, as people are often stripped away from each other during war as well. So there are a few parallels here. And I'm wondering if you see that the green world can also act as a space where people can suspend their own reality or escape in some kind of soothing kind of way.
Mm. Yeah, so it's sometimes that is the case. I mean, I think probably most of the examples I've given so far have been sort of the opposite
Definitely.
to that. The where there's a
Yeah.
clear connection between Shakespeare, a particular play, and the wartime context. But yeah,
Yeah.
there are in other occasions, other instances, Shakespeare is used in a way that seems to encourage a sort of escape from the realities of conflict. I mean, a couple of examples could be there was an account printed in again in the Times in the Second World War of a soldier who'd been imprisoned and what he was doing while he was imprisoned was reading Shakespeare. And the plays that he chooses to read or single out anyway, it's A Midsummer Night's Dream and Romeo and Juliet and The Tempest. And it was the lines that he draws attention to are things like, language that makes him think of home, that makes him think of being on a beach or being by a riverside or walking in the Sussex forest. And so Shakespeare seems to act as a reminder of home and as an escape from the surroundings that this individual has found themselves in. Yeah, there are instances where that can happen when British soldiers, for example, occupied New York during the American War of Independence. They put on plays in a theater, and they didn't really they never performed Henry V. They did perform quite a few English monarchical histories, which we could read into a kind of political application there. But they also liked comedies and farces, and there really does seem to be a sense that they weren't wanting to stage something that echoed their surrounding situation. This was this was a pastime. This was a time to forget about conflict. But I also think there's an interesting way in which plays by Shakespeare that encourage escape can also have quite a political sort of agenda. So in the Second World War, there was a film made about productions of Shakespeare's plays that was sponsored by the Council for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts, which was basically the first organization to sponsor theatre in Britain in its history. Or the first state-sponsored theatre. And the play that they chose to feature in a film about Seymour was Merry Wives of Windsor, which is one of the most, there's nothing about Merry Wives of Windsor really that you can link to the context of the Second World War. And you see clips of this performance, Falstaff's, kind of bumbling misadventures in that play, and you get it cuts to images of the audience, laughing hysterically at this. So there is a sense of escape within that, but it's also within a kind of propaganda film that is also saying, this is what we're fighting for. This is, remember to support the war effort, remember to do your bit to support the war effort. And Shakespeare is a figurehead that you are fighting to protect. So there's that kind of tension between something that seems escapist, but then there is a way in which that is channeled to perform a particular function as well. And there's another really interesting example. In the First World War, about 5,000 British civilians were interned in Ruhleben, which is a civilian internment camp on the outskirts of Berlin. And many of them were held there for the duration of the war. So they lived there for 4 years, and they set up their own little communities. So they had a university, they had a theatre, they had a library, they had a shopping street, and Shakespeare was performed every so often, and Ruhleben translates as the quiet life. So in some ways it was kind of positioned as, although you are captive, but this is, you're being removed from your everyday world, and this is your quiet life here. And they performed As You Like It. That was one of the first plays they staged, and it was the forest scenes from As You Like It. So you get the sense that that there is that the internees were looking for that link to finding themselves in an unusual setting, removed from home, and using Shakespeare to pass the time, using Shakespeare to process their experiences of internment. But again, it never quite loses its connection to the wartime context. And there was a kind of parody of that famous "All the World's a Stage" speech from As You Like It that appeared in their camp magazine at about the same time. And it was, instead of "All the World's a Stage," it was "All the World's a Cage." And the men within it, weary players. They each have their entrances but no exits. So it was kind of responding line by line to that famous soliloquy. And there is this real sense that although Shakespeare is being used and often invoked as something to help you forget about the trauma of your imprisonment, it's always something that is feeding into that at the same time.
Wow. So they're actually allowing their own experience to change the language of the Shakespearean text. And as the Shakespearean text speaks to them, they are able to speak through the text as well in a way. So it really is that shared consciousness in a way, giving the consciousness into the text and allowing the text to impact yourself, whether it's for escape or it's for actually representing your situation. I find that distinction really interesting. That's how sometimes people gravitate towards using Shakespeare as a tactic of escape and going into the green world and trying to forget, even if a bit of the self and a bit of the experience creeps in. You know, as you're saying, they change the words to reflect their experience. Even if that happens, the ultimate goal is we're trying to forget, we're trying to escape. And then you have the other side that is actually, no, I'm going to use this text to depict my experience as closely as possible. And I'm going to use this text to directly impact my experience, to unite the soldiers, to unite the audience members, to encourage people, to facilitate a sense of nationalism. We're actually going to feed the people's consciousness into the text and allow the text to feed it back and influence that. I think that's also a really interesting distinction. I wonder why or what prompts one to choose one way or the other, forgetting versus using it to empower and to lift up and to actually represent rather than forget, to be as specific and precise as possible. I feel like they are, you're right, they really are opposite reactions, but they're, I'm sure, both equally prevalent. So I think that distinction is really, really fascinating. I wonder what comes of that. So yeah.
Yeah, there are some comments about, kind of suggesting that Shakespeare should be used for to help us forget the conflict, forget our moment, or also suggesting that Shakespeare instead, or theatre instead, should help us to understand our experiences more. So that is something that that is discussed quite often within reception or reviews or the accounts of individuals who've been trying to, stage Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare's often because of the kind of cultural capital that Shakespeare's accrued over the centuries. The performance of his plays does tend to end up getting linked to something that seems to serve the war effort. And there were in the First World War, there were quite a few actors who thought what we need to do is we need to perform Shakespeare, and they actually encountered resistance from the government, who might want to help to facilitate their performances to troops, and also from soldiers, because they didn't want Shakespeare something that is a bit too highbrow, or that might not help us to forget the conflict. Instead, we really want something very lighthearted. We want music. We want musical entertainment. We want farces instead of Shakespeare. Shakespeare doesn't help us to forget, or Shakespeare might make us feel as if we're being educated. So there's a lot of sort of debating and fighting over Shakespeare in many of these conflicts.
Definitely. And I find what you said about the whole highbrow aspect, I find that also very interesting and very telling, because you're right, as you mentioned with that quote, that many working class British or English men had not read many pages of Shakespeare. I wonder if that also feeds into this a little bit, that we're using a very kind of intellectual, highbrow cultural figure and his texts to invigorate and motivate a war effort that is largely made up of working class men. I find that also a really interesting, cultural phenomenon, for lack of better phrase, because what does that mean if your motivating figure is someone that is opposite to you and your background? Do you know what I mean? I find that also really interesting as well. But I also wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today. I so appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time to explain all of this to us. I'm sure everyone listening has learned a lot. And my final question for you today is, do you have any advice for young scholars who are interested in studying Shakespeare, early modern literature, or wartime Shakespeare?
Yeah, I mean, I think my advice would just be to keep reading and to keep questioning. I mean, I think one of the questions you often are asked, maybe by people who don't specialize in Shakespeare or early modern literature, is there really anything left to say about Shakespeare? And I mean, the answer is, I'm biased, but the answer is, of course, yes, there is. And that how we use Shakespeare is often, and how we interpret Shakespeare and how we look to the past and write about Shakespeare's use over the centuries, is a lot of it is a reflection of our own times and our own moments and things that are happening now. And so there's always this need to return to Shakespeare. There's always a need to question how we've been writing about literature, how we've been writing about history, and to revise that. So there's plenty of work to do. So, keep reading and keep questioning, and find the thing that interests you, because there's plenty of potential.
Thank you so much. That's brilliant advice. I'm sure everyone listening will take it. And again, thank you so much for joining us today and for speaking to us about your book and about this literature, and about Shakespearean wartime. And yeah, I appreciate it. And I'm sure everyone listening, learned a lot. So thank you again.
Thank you, Daphne.